Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Destinies History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with guest Russell Smith, PhD candidate, who is undertaking research in the College of Arts. Russell is a published fiction author and more recently a historian who has recently undertaken an MA in history at Leicester University. Formerly a heritage ambassador for the Tottenham Hotspur Foundation, Russell has also been a research volunteer with the Royal Air Force Museum for 3 years, with a focus on exploring the RAF's wartime and post-war race relations, which he continues to research for his PhD. So let's have a listen.
Thank you, Russell Smith, for coming on to the podcast, Destinies History, and talking about the Royal Air Force, RAF, in regards to the two world wars and how the African and Caribbean people volunteered to serve. So before we start, can I just have you do a brief introduction of yourself?
Hi. My name's Russell Smith, as you heard. Most of my day at the moment is that I am a PhD candidate at University of Glasgow on the as one of the students on the James McCune Smith Scholarship, which I can talk about another time, or you can have a look at it. So, it's a name for a black pioneer at University of Glasgow who is so far given to a more modern legacy. But we've also outside that I write fiction and some gaming books as well. So right. Quite a lot of writing, quite a lot of volunteering for various conventions as well. That's pretty much that's a lot of what I do.
Oh, very nice, and good that you're ready and doing other things as well to balance yourself is a great thing. So, what would you say in terms of, I guess, with the motivation of African and Caribbean men and women who volunteered for service in the Royal Air Force for both the two world wars, despite the racial inequalities they faced at home and abroad? What would you say is their, if you can speak to their motivation?
Yeah, see, I love this question because this could be the entire podcast very easily. I mean, I'm going to give. I'll answer this as best I can, but the short answer is there were as many motivations as there were volunteers quite a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
There's some stories there's some common narratives we'll probably hear more often than others. Splitting this during the World Wars, this one's quite easy. The Royal Air Force itself didn't exist as it was until 1918, so it was quite late. So it was quite late in the First World War. What we had before that, which military was the Army had the Royal Flying Corps, and the Navy had Royal Naval Air Service, and the two merged to form the Royal Air Force. So First World War was a little different on that. But you still had, a couple of notable faces. One of the names you'll probably hear most is William Robinson Clark, who was a mechanic back, who was a mechanic back in Jamaica, I think, and a driver as well. So that's how he started. But when he was eager to get over, so he paid his own, found his own money, paid to get over, and serve in the war, and started. He started as a driving mechanic there, and eventually found some pilot aptitude. So he became a pilot, or what was known as a pilot sergeant. There was again another like long thing to get into, but the rank system with the Royal Air Force was a little odd in terms of quite a lot of the time. If you were a pilot, you were an officer, but not always. So and in his case, he wasn't initially anyway. So yeah, he managed to get through, and he did did that through his own money and his own determination, and became a figure well worth looking at now. So I couldn't say. So I mean, I couldn't say a lot of why with him, other than he wanted to. But that was that was a big thing as well. Even so, getting to the Second World War, you've got conversations have been happening. We started talking briefly before the cast about people who are getting together and talking to each other where that might not have been previously possible. And yeah, but in terms of why they wanted to join, lots of reasons. Could have been simple as I mean, earlier in the war, you see, earlier in the Second World War, specifically, particularly with officers wanting to volunteer, it's because they can see what is going on. It's because they can see what's going on in the larger picture, and you've got conversations happening as to well, okay, maybe we're not too delighted with the British Empire, but the alternative is worse. So how about we help out, and we can have a conversation afterwards? And I think that's, if I had to pick one of the big themes as to why, that would probably be where I'd go. So you get the likes of Ulrich Cross having that conversation, and then dedicating entirely to the cause whilst on there, and also Sam King, who settled over here and became a mayor, and one of the Windrush passengers. And he was he's been seen repeatedly, even long after the war, saying, well, look, this is the choice we were faced with. So I know which side I was on. So I'd say that's the common one you'll hear. Later in the war, you've got to look at other fairly straightforward things like economic conditions, and certainly around 44, Jamaica was the Caribbean is experiencing terrible weather, and it wiped out a lot of the crop economy. So jobs were needed. So we had a swell of grounds crew at the time, towards the late end of the war as well.
Yeah, and as you said, they were part of the empire, so they were still British subjects because they weren't independent per se, right, at that time, and just feeling aligned to the empire. Yeah,
and yet there were yes, depending on when you joined, there were differences on the level of resistance you get. I mean, as soon as early when the war broke out, the first year, 1939, there were the volunteers who were sort of capable of who were capable of funding themselves over to recruitment offices in the UK went over and were turned away because largely there were still active restrictions on. I believe the usual phrasing was for certain recruitment was of pure European descent. So, and you can interpret that as you will. So, it was around, it was around autumn 1939 when the coalition government in the UK actually temporarily, and I do stress temporarily, lifted the race restrictions. It still took a little while for that to filter through. So that's why you see different that's why you tend to see different phases of recruitment happening. And then of course you have it's a horrible thing to say, but as wartime is very much a case of supply and demand, and certainly by the time you're getting mid 1940, the Battle of Britain, which everyone hears quite a lot about, and the Battle of France previously. Between these two things, the pilot pool depleted quite heavily, so
definitely
to recruit by then. But of course, you get 2.5 years down the line on that, and they've kind of hit a point where they can't recruit any more. Then when they have to slow down, they have to slow down a fair bit on that. So
yeah, definitely. And would you be able to describe, I guess, the recruitment process for the African and Caribbean individuals, and how they were encouraged to enlist by the Royal Air Force?
On paper, the recruitment process wasn't terribly different anywhere across the services, but in practice, to an extent, it still did depend on did depend a fair bit on where you were, and as I think I got into a little bit just a minute ago, also depended on what time of what stage of the war you were in as to ease of recruitment for particular branches. So early, as I say, when the war had first broken out, you could pretty much forget, and you could pretty much forget about getting an officer commission early on, unless you. But I say this. Any one thing I say, I can very likely find some kind of contradiction for, because as with certainly on the officer side, and we're dealing with class as much as we are dealing with race to an extent. So there were a couple of instances where who you knew, or what.
Yeah, of course.
What even to some extent, if you were if we could fit you in on the cricket team, things would happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, early on we had to deal with the various government processes as to how recruitment was going to work. I mean, that wasn't restricted. It wasn't by any means restricted to Caribbean recruits. They were looking at this empire wide. It's just the only thing is, one rule wasn't the only thing was, it wasn't one universal rule a lot of the time. Things were different depending on where you were. The Bahamas, for example, they had very different race restrictions, and seen documentation where they recommended not lifting the colour bar at all. So, but Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados famously have squadrons named for them in the Royal Air Force, and the reason for that was that the national authorities had and the nation as a whole had actually sort of sent sponsorship and funding and ended up functioning with buying some of the planes for them. So conversations were happening high up, and well, look, if people want to join, we should let them. But then there's other conversations going, well, I'm not sure we can't. I'm not sure whether we can have and it was an age-old the age-old conversation of I'm not sure if I'm not sure if white subordinates are going to take orders from black superiors in terms of rank structure, forgetting that it's the system's there for what it's supposed to be. So it's yeah, all these conversations are happening, but people are still managing to get through. And like I say, the other big thing was there were different phases of things happening. So that was a lot of what I described as fairly early on. Say the time you get to the time you get halfway through 1940, there's a desperate shortage for pilots, and that needs to be filled. But again, when you get halfway through 1942, and that's fairly that's fairly covered now. So we need other things like ground crew. So in terms of raw numbers, the bulk of what you see with Caribbean volunteers by the end of the war are ground crew.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not the stories you hear quite as much, because obviously, again, we go back to both, couple of matters of obviously flying is a lot more glamorous, let's face it. It's just a thing you will hear about. So it's nice to know that you can get there. But also, again, the likelihood is if you're flying in any capacity, you're probably officer class, which meant well, if talking about it in after the war terms, am I going to be talking about the job you went back to, or the possibility that you were going to be running the country in 20 years' time, which I can name at least 3 officers who were. So
yeah, it definitely failed them to certain things. And then further to what you said, it's like, how were these African and Caribbean airmen and airwomen trained, and how did their training come into compare, I guess, to their British counterparts?
well, strictly speaking, on the in terms of Royal Air Force recruitment, you should realistically expect have expected at least 99 times out of 100 exactly the same training as the depending on and the training shouldn't have been dependent upon who it was, and more what they were training for. So if you're on flying duties, you're through everyone, regardless of whether they ended up at everyone who was training to be, say, on a bomber crew, for example, would if they were on the flying duties, the 3 things you would train up to would be piloting, navigating, and bomb aimer, P&B as they commonly abbreviated it. So you should, in theory, have been able to do all. You should, in theory, have been able to do all 3. So the only thing with so I'm spending a lot of time on aircrew, but I think
that's fine. You
kind of have to with this sort of thing. But the only thing with that, it was, and I haven't got far enough into research to say definitively this is so, but there have certainly been stories from commonly navigators, the Caribbean navigators, because that was you'll see the prominent the prominent officer stories that you will have heard will have been from Caribbean navigators rather than always Caribbean pilots. And this gets into a whole conversation about the composition of a of an aircrew. Because with fighters, it's quite easy. There's generally one, two at the most in the plane, and then you don't have to worry about the whole conversation of captaincy and the likes. Yes. Whereby the Air Force have had to have the conversation of, well, should the captain be the pilot? Doesn't that make most sense? So that happens, but then you start having, then when you get the aircrew together, and let's give you an example. You'll have a navigator from Trinidad, a pilot from say New Zealand, Australian air gunner, a Canadian somewhere else. This is not an unusual composition for a bomber crew. So, but where that conversation gets a little bit tasty is where you some of the higher ups have said, well, can we make the Trinidadian a captain of this? So if the answer is no, then they cannot be the pilot. So these conversations are happening, and I think that's one of the distinction difficulties. On the ground crew side, other things I had read about, and again, this is a little bit later in the war, where they do start. You can see certain service restrictions are happening, but they're for some very strange reasons. Even though, Royal Air Force still have boat crews that might be search and rescue or something or other. But I was reading up on this, and I was reading some of the conversations they were having about this, and they were sort of, well, we're going to just. There was a whole thing where they'd actually eventually got to restricting Caribbean ground crew from joining the boat crew, for the reason that they were getting fed up of complaints of the cold, and it was causing service issues because they were being off because they were saying, look, the last couple we recruited were just constantly moaning and being off sick because they were cold and wet. So so that ended up being a thing. And the other one that I still need to write up was the one that really got me, dentistry and some of the medical business. And I started reading the file by accident, but the more I ended up reading of the file, I was trying to figure out exactly why this was all going on. And as far as I can tell from what I was reading, and just from some of the stories I was hearing, it was broadly a matter of some social embarrassment where they didn't want black medical crew seeing or touching or whatever. So that was as far as I could tell. I still need to finish writing that up so I can finish getting the answer on that. But the more I was reading, I was sort of, why is this? Because it didn't make sense when you first read the file at all. But the more you got into it, was, oh right, okay, this is the only explanation I can come up with.
No, for sure. And then I think you talked about it at the very beginning of this discussion is, were there any notable African and Caribbean pilots or airbag who achieved distinction during the wars?
Yeah, I mean, if you told me to name one, the first place I would go is Ulrich Cross, who's from Trinidad, and I would struggle to name. I would struggle to name other too many Caribbean wartime veterans who had a film about them, but he does. It's called Hero: The Life and Extraordinary Times of Mr. Ulrich Cross, and the thing was, he was he was one of the very navigators we spoke about, and he ended up being in a specialist navigator squadron called the Pathfinders, and they had a particularly tricky job in that they had to go out at, well, it's very much as the name sounds. They had to go out at night time, fly low level, little or no lighting, so that they wouldn't be spotted, and so they could drop flares and light the way for the next bombers to actually hit their targets, because there was an accuracy problem. Extremely dangerous job. You'd be looking, I think if I remember rightly, the average mission mission expectancy for most Pathfinder crews was six sorties missions, or it crossed at 80.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
yeah, as far as I know, wasn't shot down. He got himself very decorated. Distinguished Service Order, Distinguished Flying Cross, bar, so he had that twice. And going back to the film, this was about his wartime career was 2 minutes of the film. So that'll tell you how much he did, after that. I mean, famously High Court judge, did a lot of work with Pan-Africanist movements post-war as well. Very up in the legal profession, broadcaster even for some time with the BBC, which is not an uncommon route. And yeah, he is somebody you can very easily go and look things up on, because he's one of the better known stories now. Likewise, the other two names I know of both ended up prisoners of war. Actually, there was Cy Grant and Johnny Smythe. Johnny Smythe was actually from Sierra Leone. So, yeah, he'd very very tall man, got shot down, managed to survive as a prisoner of war. So. So he had that going, and he helped with some escapes, but because it's part of your official duty as an officer as a prisoner of war, I think, but didn't actually get out on any of the escapes because obvious difficulties in that you can't exactly disguise yourself as readily, shall we say. So yeah, those were, and yeah, Cy Grant was British from British Guyana, and he again another prisoner of war. But afterwards, he started in the legal profession, which again is quite a common tie for some of the officers there. But it wasn't too satisfied with that, not getting enough cases. So he went the other way from Ross, in that he became he went into broadcasting after that, and actually became quite a well-known entertainer. And don't know if you've heard of Captain Scarlet, but he was the voice of Lieutenant Green.
Oh,
yeah. Okay. So it is interesting to see some of the paths. And there was Errol Barrow as well, who was who navigated, who was the personal navigator for the chief of the air staff, and he ended up becoming the first Prime Minister of Barbados.
Oh, wow. These are all fascinating stories, and I'll make sure to put some of these in the show notes as well. So if others want to dig deep, they can, because again, these are, I think we, as we were discussing before we started recording, is again, narratives that are not really told, and most people wouldn't be necessarily aware of this type of involvement, and to even think that, because as I said, for myself growing up, going to school here in Canada, you don't hear about, African or Caribbean individuals participating in the war. It's not something that is readily told, so to speak, right? So it's just one of those things. And I guess, going on that, like, how did the African and Caribbean volunteers, form their own sense of community or brotherhoodship while serving the Royal Air Force?
Well, this is yeah, I mean, this is one I'm still looking into, but
Mhm.
it was I think again there's a bit of a mixture of answers on this one,
Mhm,
in that
mhm.
yeah, it's in fact this is probably quite a central thing I'm trying to find out for my thesis, actually. So the way it an important thing to I think an important place to start is in terms of the service itself.
Mhm.
The Royal Air Force didn't operate in segregated units the
Okay.
way some things did. So
Mhm.
it's which is good in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
When it comes to when it comes to trying to research individuals or squadrons, it's an important thing to know, because you can't then go looking and saying, right, this is an all black unit, because it wasn't really wasn't really as much a thing with the Royal Air Force. So you'd find you'd find pockets of community, and
Mhm.
I know this because of veterans I speak of veterans and active service I'm speaking to now, and I think there's quite a lot of there's quite a bit of a through line on that in terms of in terms of how it's gone. But yeah, I mean, I think I, what I'm often trying to look at is how, you know is how much, say, Caribbean culture managed to filter into what was going on with the Air Force at large. Because what was happening? So I think the main thing that was happening, like I was discussing with the bomber crews, it was the Empire at the time was, they were able to come together in ways that I think previously they hadn't been. So you'd be so camaraderie would be occurring, but also a lot of filtering of information as to how things worked in Australia, how things worked in Canada, how things worked in how things worked in Jamaica, and
Yes. Mhm.
they're just talking to each other all the time about various things, and see where this is. Yeah, obviously where this really impacts is I'll probably talk about on on later questions upcoming. So
Mhm. No, no, and it's good to know that there was no segregation, in the sense that everybody all came together. Because I think you mentioned it before earlier in the discussion about with the pilots. Pilot could be from New Zealand or Australia, and of course, either from Trinidad. And just to know that, to understand all those different accents sometimes can be a challenge. But it's just good to know that that was the basis for things. And
yeah, I mean, I can speak about this a lot with
mhm,
certainly in terms of the European theatre. Obviously, there are different things going on depending on where you.
mhm,
So I mentioned it's probably a bit different in the Bahamas, because the different regulations going on. But I haven't looked into that enough to say
yeah.
to be able to answer the, well, how did they bond question.
Exactly, exactly. And then I know you kind of mentioned this a little bit in terms of, after, how did the wartime experience of the African and Caribbean impact their role in post-Caribbean and British society?
And that's why I held off a bit on answering that
Mhm,
previous question, because
mhm,
one of the things that I would chiefly mention with what was going on while everyone from around the world were talking were on the same plane or each other, or in the same rooms talking to each other, is that there was a much better picture being able to form of how you could see how the empire was working as a whole, and how it worked differently in various other bits and pieces. So you can go home from that armed with a bit of knowledge on what was a better future. But I maintain some of this conversation started in the previous World War, because it's again that same thing of, look, we've got we're helping we are helping you, providing our services for this war. What can you do for us?
Yes.
Sort of, can we have a conversation afterwards? And it probably happened a lot less in terms of having a conversation with the Empire, and by the end of the First World War, but it didn't mean that the conversation weren't happening with each other. So by the time you get 20 however many years on after that, these same conversations are going on, but also there's a little bit more weight to it. And obviously a lot of differences in how and obviously there's been a lot of changes in terms of some of the I mean, there were entire chunks of generations wiped out in the First World War. So so the world was changing, and quite fundamentally so. So by the time you get by the time you what I mentioned a little earlier with the likes of Ulrich Cross and Sam King talking and weighing up, well, where do we sit? Where do we sit in this? And they've done that before. They've done that before they volunteered. So you know that it's going somewhere. So by the end of the war, there's a lot more conversations ready to be had about, well, can we be independent? It's taking time, but it's all happening in the background. I don't think you don't just go from right, suddenly we're independent, but so you've got and obviously these British authorities are sitting there thinking, well, it's not best for us, so we need to figure out if what we can do to keep everybody on board. And it's just, so there's a lot of conversations happening. There's a lot of conversations happening at once, but that then gets to that then obviously leads to other things. And of course, these days, the reason I was focusing primarily on Royal Air Force is that these days one of the big stories you'll hear is about the Empire Windrush voyage.
Yes.
Which of course was an RAF troop ship. So, but it was so much more. So in terms of what it ended up being, I'm sure they didn't know this at the time, but it's
definitely the Windrush is definitely something. And I guess going to the contributions of both, African and Caribbean Royal Air Force volunteers, has it been, normally recognized and remembered in both British and the Caribbean?
Well, this is a constant source of questioning, because I mean, honestly, it speaking of Windrush, even though a lot of this, even though it would be wrong for me to say we'd only just heard about it in the last decade or so, because that's not right at all. Things have been going on. Speak to Arthur at the Windrush Foundation. Things have been going on since back in the day, and a long time before anyone is. But unfortunately, it was one of these things whereby our government at the time had managed to create the Windrush scandal, which was a bunch of you'd speak about as well. Documented settlers suddenly not being documented
Exactly. Yeah.
in terms of how it went, and they were just deporting people who had been here for 50 years and had
Mm-hmm.
lives, grandkids and whatever, and it's just it wasn't something anyone could sit and keep quiet about.
Yeah.
And it certainly wasn't something that was going to, well, it wasn't going to go away. I mean, I can't say necessarily there's been anything like adequate apologies, and there's certainly inquiries still going on that got swept under the carpet because of other things happening. We won't. I can't get into any detail on that because it's not been the focus of what I've been looking at, but I know. So it's but I suppose the one positive side effect of this is that as soon as you've got the name Windrush going on, it's like, well, what was there a scandal of? So of course more of the histories come out, and it's not like it wasn't there. It's just there has been something of an increase in interest in it, which in turn creates the ability to research more, because there's more funding about projects and various questions about monuments or questions about what was happening here, and what do we do with Clapham bomb shelter now? Yeah, so I think if we hadn't had such a loud conversation about various things, we wouldn't have. I think it wouldn't have been spotlighted quite as hard as a significant point in modern history. So.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it just opens up one door, opens up another door type of thing. So, and this leads to my next question in regards to, the role of African and Caribbean volunteers in the Royal Air Force, as, again, not being widely acknowledged or popular in World War history. Do you think that is changing?
Yeah, it is. It's slow, and it's not. It's slow. It's not by any means universal, and there's certainly, because of the state of the world, an amount of backlash that is needing to be navigated as well, because it wasn't just the Caribbean volunteer contribution that had been readily discarded for the sake of a different narrative by any means. So, but what it has meant is all of these other communities have been reflecting and having conversations as to where they come through. But yeah, I mean, there's been notable points in in various remembrances where they hadn't been, invitations hadn't occurred, or that conversation hadn't happened. But within our own communities now, that certainly hasn't. That certainly has happened. So there is a so that sense of pride is enough to is enough to make sure that these conversations continue, and more doors are getting opened. And it's been very helpful as well that that museums and media have wanted to open these conversations, because the more you can, the more you can spread awareness of this, and so the song gets spread. So.
No, absolutely. Because I know when I first started researching my family tree and coming across some of these records, and knowing that, some of my extended family members were part of the World Wars, which is, again, I guess the reason why I even reached out to your organization is just to be able to discuss this, because I was kind of taken aback to know that there were Caribbean and Africans that were part of either World War, and not really again, not a narrative that's told very often. So good to know that this is now being discussed more. And what I'll do as well is I'll put up some of the pictures if people are watching this of the individuals and their names, so they can be able to see that as well. And what would you say, I guess, for modern day service members and civilians? What can they learn from these experiences of the African and Caribbean RAF volunteers in terms of their resilience and duty for equality?
I think I think one of the most important things is just it. I think it's probably I well, I don't imagine I know, because I've spoken to some in active service, and these things never came out. So what they didn't have is so I am. There'll have been a generation who there'll have been a generation or two or three that will have joined up, not knowing that there was some previous heritage there at all. And I honestly I will say that, because I've spoken to people, it's like, well, I didn't know, I hadn't realized, because it's not something that was taught in my day necessarily, and not something you commonly see. So people who knew, but it still wasn't there still wasn't this, I'm going to join because I particularly look up to this figure. I mean, it's not why a lot of people do join, but it's still interesting to see that there's been some sort of through line. So yeah, so
Yes, as we close, and in terms of what is your opinion about the most lasting impact of of African and Caribbean service members to the Royal Air Force on both British military history and Caribbean identity?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is why this is why I was centering on the Royal Air Force, because I think I say this a lot to people, but the Windrush story and the RAF's relationship with this are not things that you can split up, really. They are intrinsically tied in that part of history. So I think it's essential to examine that and see what went to and from with that. So that is a big question. That is a big question I'm trying to get an answer to, I suppose. Likewise, it probably mentioned a little earlier, we've got we had a legacy whereby a number of the veterans went on to fairly very prominent careers, usually commonly politically, and I think I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that their experiences, their wartime experiences with the Royal Air Force will have shaped this in some manner.
No, thank you so much. And I really appreciate that you came on and to be able to speak to this. As I said, it's just one of those narratives that are not really told. And as I said, it wasn't until I was researching my family tree to be able to come across some of these stories and to know that some family members had been able to participate. So I do appreciate your time, Russell, for coming on and speaking to this. And thank you.
Of course, anytime.
Perfect.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.